Now I am recording the session, so all those will be able to watch it at a different point in time. Um, I will introduce the presenters, and then they will speak, one by one. And then if you have questions to ask of them, please, you can use the Q&A in the Hough app or apparently on Zoom, whichever, and we'll just kind of try to go through them after the sessions are over. And yeah, so we'll just make it as kind of easy as possible. So to start things off, Ashley Shaw will be talking and presenting a paper called When Psychiatrists Believe in UFOs, what Dr. John Mack can teach us about rhetoric behind believing. And Ashley received a JD from Faulkner University before working in legal editing and marketing for several years before deciding that education is where she wanted to be. Now she is pursuing a PhD in English, rhetoric, and composition at Georgia State University, where she is currently working on a dissertation on the rhetorical moves of con artists. So I'll take it away.
All right. Oh, I might have a problem. What is happening? There's bad weather here, and my printer wouldn't work, and the power was out. And so I was going to just read my paper off my phone, but now that's not working either because Google Docs is apparently down. So let's see if I can do this another way and get it that way. I had my paper up and ready to start. But what I will do is I had created a little handout that just has all the direct quotes I'll be doing so that they can get credit for it and all the works cited that I did, just in case people want to see that. So I will share that in the chat, and then hopefully this will be working by the time I get up. It's one of those things where everything that can go wrong will go wrong. So I'm sorry. I might, like I said, I might lose power because it's getting bad weather, but oh, at least this pulled up, I think. Okay, so today I am going to talk a little bit about Dr. John Mack. And Dr. Mack had a pretty impressive resume if you've never heard of him. He was a psychiatrist, but not just any psychiatrist. He was the head of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. So he was a psychiatrist of some note. And in fact, according to a Psychology Today article, he was actually one of the men who forged Harvard's Cambridge Hospital Department of Psychology and turned it into a premier teaching hospital. He was also a Pulitzer Prize winner. He won for his book, A Prince of Our Disorder, which was a biography on T.E. Lawrence. So in other words, Dr. Mack was a pretty smart guy and kind of an enviable career. He was also a believer in UFOs, aliens, and more specifically, alien abductions. So how did that happen? How did such an educated, savvy man come to believe in such kooky sounding stuff? Of course, one possibility is that these things are real. Maybe in all of his research, Dr. Mack came across a truth that more of us need to accept. Maybe the people saying they were abducted by aliens really did have an alien encounter. Maybe for those of us who have our doubts, we just need to learn to be a little less skeptical. So that's one possibility. And another is that Dr. Mack fell for something. Despite his background and his knowledge, despite his ability to analyze and research, despite all of this, he heard the stories and he believed, regardless of how little evidence he had to suggest it to be true. So if that's the case, though, then why? What happened? What made him so susceptible to these narratives? And if the head of psychiatry at Harvard can fall for such outlandish tales, then aren't we all at risk for falling for something? So today I'm going to walk through how Dr. Mack went from distinguished professor to some guy who somewhat became the embarrassment of Harvard. In the process, I'm going to examine what caused him to believe and what it means for everyone else. Ultimately, I am looking for insights into the human psyche. What makes us believe? And how can we recognize this vulnerability in ourselves so that we can stop falling for the things we do, and me. But before I go too far into this, let me just give you a little disclaimer about myself. So I'm not a psychiatrist. Psychiatry does fascinate me, though. I'm a rhetorician, or at least a wannabe one. So I'm looking at this a little outside the lens that other people might look at. But it's ultimately, I'm looking at it with the goal of bringing it back into my own perspective, which is recognizing the words and gestures and things that people do to persuade us and why we are or are not persuaded by them. So however, there's a bigger goal, or that's a bigger goal. For this specific presentation, I am more focused on Dr. Mack as a case study that can later be expanded into that bigger study. So with that out in the open, let's talk a little bit about aliens. According to the introduction Mack wrote to his book Abduction, this whole saga began in 1989 when a colleague asked Dr. Mack if he'd like to meet Bud Hopkins. At the time, the doctor had never heard this name, but when he found out Hopkins was an artist who claimed to have been taken by aliens into their spaceship, Mack said something along the lines of, well, he must be crazy and so are they, simultaneously knocking down not only poor Bud, but the entire collective of alien abductees. Despite this, a few months later, on January 10th, 1990, the coworker took Mack to meet Hopkins, even if he did have his doubts. In this visit, Mack was struck with, to quote him, Hopkins' warmth, sincerity, intelligence, and caring, as the artist told Mack not only Hopkins' story, but the story of people with similar encounters all over the country. As Mack started delving into the alien abduction stories, he had a goal: to use his psychiatry background to help create a diagnosis for the obvious mental illness. But a few years after he started, Mack, as Neil Boyce wrote in an article called The Psychiatrist Who Wanted to Believe, made a startling announcement. He had been seeing patients who claimed to have been abducted by aliens, and he believed them. This was a crazy turn of events and one that his colleagues weren't necessarily happy about. There are many theories about why this happened, but for starters, Boyce, a journalist who conducted interviews with some of Mack's colleagues and examined his work, had a theory. Mack believed because Mack wanted to believe. The idea that our belief system is in large part dependent on our current beliefs is a long accepted idea within psychiatry. I mean, we all probably have heard the term confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the tendency in all of us to seek out or acknowledge things that confirm what we already believe or think we know. In my own field of rhetoric, this is also a theory behind many studies examining why we can be persuaded by the things we are persuaded by. In Wayne C. Booth's The Rhetoric of Rhetoric, for example, he said that all of us are thirsty for evidence supporting what we already strongly believe. And when it is offered, we too often take it straight. And in The Confidence Game, Maria Konnikova says that we are all capable of falling for something because we all have the basic, irresistible, universal human need to believe in something that gives life meaning, something that reaffirms our view of ourselves, the world, and our place in it. Expanding on this, she goes on to show why stories are so powerful. We want meaning, and when we don't have it, we go looking for it. And it is there that we can be fooled, because con artist, Konnikova's focus, or any other irresistible tale, feeds on our desire for magic, exploiting our endless taste for an existence that is more extraordinary and somehow more meaningful. So let's see if this theory holds up for Dr. Mack. At first glance, it seems like the problem is that Mack didn't believe. In fact, his whole purpose in conducting these interviews was to prove the stories of alien abductions were false. So how can a desire to believe be the answer? Well, in a couple of ways, this is actually a compelling argument. For starters, one of Mack's colleagues, Dr. Edward Cantizan, I'm sorry to him, I do not know how to pronounce his last name, explained his own theory on what he thinks happens, and he blames it all on the ground of a faulty instrument, specifically the tools of regressive hypnosis. Cantizan explained that Mack fully believed in the capabilities of this tool, but as Professor Chris French explained it, the problem with hypnotic regression is you get pretty much what you expect to get. If you go into a session expecting to recover memories of alien abductions, that's most likely what you're going to get. If you go in thinking you're going to recover past life memories of being Mary, Queen of Scots, then that's what you'll get. Mack believed in hypnotic regression's ability to pull real stories from those who undertook it. He believed in its power to help reveal the truth, and when he used it on his patients, he believed that it would help them find the truth. His criteria in his interviews was stated in his first work on the topic, Abductions. He only sat with patients who could recall, whether on their own or through hypnosis, an experience being taken by alien beings into a strange craft, reported with emotion appropriate to the experience being described, and no apparent mental condition that could account for the story. With this criteria, he conducted somewhere between 1 to 8 hypnosis sessions with 49 different individuals, with each session lasting several hours. He went into these sessions expecting that under hypnosis, his subjects would only be able to tell the truth. And with this expectation in mind, He went in willing to believe that what they said while under hypnosis must then be the truth. So when the stories they told under hypnosis seemed to be almost identical to the stories they had told on their own accord, there was only one logical explanation he could draw. The stories themselves must be true. Of course, this isn't the only reason this theory of willingness to believe matches up. Boyce expanded on his own theory that Mack believed because he wanted to believe by discussing his and Professor Chris French's conversation on the topic, where French told him that one thing you notice when listening to alien abduction stories is that the emotion that they show is very, very real. It's the emotions of the situation that observers get swept up in and find so compelling. When you know anything about Dr. Mack, you know that he was someone susceptible to what he perceived to be honest emotions. In fact, in his foreword to Abductions, he mentioned that he felt his newest work was not surprising considering his earlier, more acclaimed work. He felt that one led to the other. While from his perspective, this was because he had spent a lot of time studying identity, specifically who we are in the deepest sense. There was another guiding theme throughout Mack's earlier work that might have made these new theories a little less surprising: empathy. A Psychology Today article written around the time that Mack wrote his first book described Mack as such: a high-profile idealist who has been at the forefront of efforts by his peers for global peace and conservation. Mack was, for all of his scientific thinking and logic-based research, a man who believed that the world could be better and that truth could be found if you just kept your mind open to it. With that lens, then, it isn't so hard to believe that these stories, from all accounts highly sincere sounding and without another logical conclusion clearly explaining what else it could be, would affect Mack in such a shocking way. Stories have a somewhat magical power. You are more affected hearing the stories of one starving child than you are hearing a statistic on the prevalence of starving people across the world. In ancient Greek, many people viewed the idea of rhetoric as magic because of words' ability to touch your emotions and make you do things you had no intention of ever doing before you heard them. Without ever meaning it to happen, you agree with the speaker and act as they want you to. It is why rhetoric can be seen as manipulative. It is through hitting these emotions that people can get us to make a donation to a nonprofit, vote for a candidate that turns out to be not who we expected, or to hand over all of our life savings to a con artist. And it could even be the catalyst that gets a kind human who wants to see the best in you to start believing that maybe you really did get abducted by an extraterrestrial. To use Boyce's explanation, abduction speaks of a man easily touched by others' emotions. Indeed, a man whose perception of others' emotional sincerity led to a belief in the reality of the experiences they described. This ability to feel and respond to others' emotions seems like a good thing, but weirdly, there's actually evidence that empathy isn't the best trait you can have. Yale researchers Paul Bloom's recently published book, Against Empathy, discusses the idea that empathy clouds our judgment, among other flaws. Better then to remain compassionate without fully absorbing the emotions of those we hear in others. So perhaps Mack's ingrained empathy was the very thing that clouded his judgment. If so, then what a skeptic wrote of him makes sense. Mack's emotion had led him into a belief system that was then maintained through an intellectual leap, giving up on the game of science entirely. And Mack himself said that his criteria for determining if one of his subjects was being sincere was whether what had been reported was felt to be real by the experiencer and was communicated sincerely and authentically to him. Also adding that you needed a degree of warmth and ability to properly do the experiments he was conducting. So what happens when a researcher that tends to lean towards empathetic acceptance over proof uses his own feelings of truth as a research method? The answer seems to be John Mack. Here's the thing about belief. It really is like magic. When it catches you and you feel that joy, it's hard to shake it no matter what. To demonstrate this, I want to kind of shift gears right now and talk about a man that you may or may not have heard before, the Amazing Randi. If you've ever seen the documentary An Honest Liar, this is who it's about. He was an illusionist, but he was also a skeptic. He performed tricks. He didn't like the term magic, almost as a way to show that it was all smoke and mirrors. He wanted people to question things. I first heard of the Amazing Randi on an episode of the podcast On the Media, where they interviewed him about his career and his organization, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. One thing he said that struck out to me was that he would sometimes end a show by explaining exactly what he did to appear psychic. Despite telling his audience that what he had done was a fraud and explaining the science behind it, He claimed to still be shocked by the amount of people who refused to believe the truth because they were already so ingrained in the falsity they accepted moments before. Instead of accepting facts, they decided this was just part of the game, and they were savvy enough to have figured out the true truth, that Randy was actually psychic and was trying to trick them into believing he wasn't. So when you want to believe something, you'll find a way to believe it, no matter what. However, I bring up Randy here for another reason, his connection to the paranormal. Before he died, Randy had an ongoing bet with the world. He offered up a cash reward to anyone who could use scientific inquiry to prove paranormal activity. In fact, he held an annual week-long conference where if anyone can demonstrate their supernatural abilities under scientific test conditions, they would win $1 million. Over the years, many tried, but none prevailed. As Randy himself said in an interview with the New York Times, though, he wasn't a fan of watching them fail, saying they're always rationalizing. There are always reasons failing why they can't do it. They call it the resilience of the duped. It's with intense regret that you watch them go down the tubes. Randy looked at the world through the lens of skepticism. He could feel for people. He could even pull for them to prove things that seemed to be only mythical. However, without physical proof, he wouldn't believe. I think this is the difference between compassion and empathy, between actually believing and simply staying open-minded. It is one thing to listen without judgment, but it is another thing to accept based off of feelings. Emotions can get the best of us, and the trust we put in our own ability to find sincerity in others can be our downfall. At the end of this presentation, it doesn't mean much for me to say what Boyce said before me. Mac believed because Mac wanted to believe, but it's the truth. All of us fall for things from time to time, and if we rationally analyzed afterwards what made us fall for it, then the truth is likely to be along that line. We believed because we wanted to believe. So how can we counter this human failing without losing our ability to see the best in humans and keep hope alive? I think in this situation, the answer is clear. We need to be less like John Mack and more like the amazing Randy. We can be open-minded and compassionate, working to not be happy in others' failures, but we can stop short of going into full empathy for them, bringing in their emotions as our own until we want to believe them so much that we do, in fact, start to believe them. We can give them a chance to prove themselves, but it requires some sort of scientific method before we accept it. So here's what I'll say to end this. I am not trying to say that nobody has ever been abducted by an alien. I can tell you I've never been abducted by an alien, and I've never seen anybody abducted by an alien. However, that doesn't necessarily say that it isn't true or that aliens don't exist. I actually agree with Matt, who in his book said that when entering experiences like this, you need to have a willingness to enter into the co-investigative process and risk being changed by the information. However, I do think on its own, that isn't enough. Be willing to be changed, but pair this with Randy's own skepticism. Be open to belief, but stop short of accepting until you have more proof than emotions. Be compassionate, but don't let empathy blind you. And if you do all these things and you still find proof of alien abductions, well, then maybe you'll have an easier time proving it than Dr. Mack did. So.
All right. Thank you, Ashley. Lots to chew on there. Okay, so we'll move to now Benjamin Crace. So he will be presenting Televangelists, UFOs, and Soul Eaters, a contemporary account of occult Christianity's sci-fi demonology. Benjamin is an assistant professor of English at the American University of Kuwait, where he has taught for the last 9 years. His areas of research include Eliot, modernism, ufology, Pentecostalism, pneumatology, and film studies. He is currently the general editor for American Blockbuster, Movies That Define Their Generations. Most recently, his work appeared in South Atlantic Review entitled An Incarnational Poetic at Play in T.S. Eliot's The Cocktail Party.
All right, thank you, guys. I'm going to share my screen for the PowerPoint presentation. All right. In the wake of the 2020 election and differentiated COVID-19 responses, the fault lines of American Christian nationalism were clearly exposed. Even up to the present, vaccine hesitancy among many Christian boomers is partly due to beliefs in eschatological schemes outlined in the 70s and 80s, schemes that centralize the American church as a key player in God's end times plan. Although not widely considered within these matrices by mainstream evangelical leaders, UFOs have indeed factored into more occluded forms of American Christian thinking in association with Judgment Day. Perpetuated today by Christian abductees and even an evangelical biblical scholar or novelist, their ideas are promulgated through popular fringe media like the Art Bell Show and alternative conservative news channels like Skywatch News. These advocates for a Christian response to UFOs also organize parallel conferences that coincide with the anniversary celebration of the Roswell incident. As the fringe becomes more and more mainstream, this presentation speculates that the literal demonization of UFOs within an eschatological frame of reference will also continue to be disseminated among American evangelicals. In short, American evangelicalism is writing its own UFO mythology, which is a mix of conspiracy, American exceptionalism, millennialism, and supernaturalism. So June 24th, 1947 is typically seen as the beginning of the modern UFO phenomenon. On that date, airline pilot Kenneth Arnold claimed to have seen the first unidentified flying objects that, quote, skipped like saucers. He didn't actually say they were saucers. He said they skipped like, they flew like them, but were actually shaped like flying wings. He has an artist's rendition there in the picture. Later accounts embellished the saucer and flying saucers were born. Less than a month later, the famous, infamous Roswell incident occurred, in which supposed wreckage of one of these saucers was found in the desert of New Mexico. And although initially the Air Force claimed it was indeed a crashed UFO, it later retracted its story, calling it a high-altitude weather balloon instead. And thus, from its beginning, the UFO phenomenon has been intricately linked to government cover-ups. And where there are cover-ups, conspiracies. More than 12,000 UFO sightings occurred between Arnold's and 1969, when Project Blue Book officially ended the Air Force's investigative involvement. Of particular note is the UFO event in Washington, D.C. in 1952, or what they call FLAPS. Multiple witnesses in 3 different airports had radar tracing on unidentified flying objects flying over our nation's capital. Fighter jets were scrambled and subsequently outrun by a dozen of the objects described as large burning balls of fire. 1 week later, a similar incident occurred again. This high-profile case that headlined national newspapers came across the radar of one O.L. Jaggers. Orville Lee Jaggers was a prominent Pentecostal healing evangelist from Arkansas, who was one of the major figures of the healing revivals in the 1940s and the 50s. Other members of the same group included Oral Roberts, who founded ORU in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Jaggers traveled extensively around the nation, preaching, healing, and giving his viewpoints on a wide variety of topics, such as his own resurrection from the dead, the second coming, how the Bible prophesied nuclear weapons, divine health, and of course, UFOs. Inasmuch as this researcher can ascertain, his work, Flying Saucers, with an exclamation mark, 1952, represents the earliest evangelical response to the then nascent phenomenon. In it, he argues that UFOs are the cherubim of God sent as a warning of impending judgment on America, citing the 1952 flap at the Capitol as significant. Nearly 2 decades before Erich von Daniken, that's the Chariots of the Gods writer, rescripted Ezekiel's vision as an ET craft, Jaggers identified Ezekiel's account as a description of a flying saucer. He writes rather prosaically, quote, in Ezekiel chapter 1, we find this description of the first. Quote. However, he sees Ezekiel's vision as a type of prophecy that adumbrates his real agenda, and that is preaching repentance for America's sins. Quote, America has become the most pagan and sinful nation in the world, end quote. He then goes on to list these pagan practices that have incurred the wrath of God. Communism, women smoking cigarettes and going to bars, widespread consumption of alcohol, 500 nudist camps, and porn. For these and other sin, he flatly states, in all caps, by the way, because of America's sins, flying saucers, the cherubim or the wheel in the middle of a wheel with supersonic and supernatural speed and power are flying over America as a warning that the judgments of God are about to fall on this unrighteous nation. The flying saucer, which is the cherubim, is flying over America more than any other nation, ready to vindicate the holiness of God and to bring God's judgments on America more than any other nation of the world. The next 15 pages further describes the problem and offers repentance and revival as the remedy. But even at this early stage of evangelical engagement with UFOs, there are apocalyptic accents. Contrary, however, to later writers, UFOs are righteous angels of the highest order. The cherubim actually stand in the presence of God. But the seeds of conspiracy are here, as he quotes the Defender magazine, a publication of called a publication of Defenders of the Christian Faith organization, which is known for its alt-right causes. So even at this early stage, there was this connection. Quote, this is him quoting the Defenders magazine. Conflicting reports from official centers lead one to believe that a studied effort is being made to keep the facts from the public, presumably fearing possible panic. The method used in releasing information suggests a plan to condition gradually the American people for the most shocking and terrifying announcement the world has ever known, when the time seems right. Here there is a studied effort to dissimulate and to, quote, condition gradually the American people about the reality of UFOs. Such speculation this far upstream becomes taken for granted lore farther down. Turn my page too quickly here. While more research is necessary to determine the reception history of Jagger's ideas, other prominent intellectuals were also weighing in on the UFO question around the same time. Perhaps the most famous was Carl Jung. His Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky came out just 7 years after Jagger's and 2 years before his own death. For him, like Jagger's, UFOs were a portent. However, they were not a sign of divine judgment, but of a new mythology began being created to address the psychic imbalance of Western culture. In short, both Jaggers and Jung were concerned with people's souls and used the UFO phenomena as a mean of addressing the spiritual malaise of life under the atomic bomb. However, as the UFO phenomenon began to include more than just things seen in the sky, Jagger's angelic harbingers, I can't get that word out, were replaced with what Joseph Laycock calls a demonized ufology. Clearly, righteous cherubim do not do sexual experimentation on abducted humans, Betty and Barney Hill, for example, nor do they communicate through mediums like George Adamaski and his Space Brethren. And although best-selling apocalyptic author Hal Lindsey forgot to mention UFOs in The Late Great Planet Earth in 1970, he knows that he thinks they are demons in his follow-up Planet Earth 2000 AD, Will Mankind Survive, which came out in 1994, and obviously we're still here. The drift from angels to demons is mirrored more broadly in the UFO community as competing hypotheses. The first is the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or ETH, that is, these are indeed visitors from outer space. The other hypothesis, emerging from the work of ufologists like J. Allen Hynek, John Keel, and Jacques Vallée, is called the interdimensional hypothesis, or IDH. IDH seeks to explain the immaterial and physics-defying aspects of the phenomenon, in short, its spiritual side. It is from within this framework that the more recent evangelical ufologists launched their demonization project. In 2017, Roswell celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Roswell crash. It was well attended and featured famous abductees such as Travis Walton, whose story was made into a Hollywood movie, Fire in the Sky. Maybe some of you have seen it. There was also a parallel conference called Modern Challenges to the Extraterrestrial Hypothesis. Its organizer was a guy named Guy Malone, an abductee and evangelical who lives in Roswell, with the stated goal of helping people see the deception behind the image. While not a Christian himself, but in the IDH camp, Nick Redfern was also presenting. Redfern is perhaps one of the most prolific paranormal writers and has made numerous appearances on Ancient Aliens, among other popular television series. With Redfern and others, Michael Heiser, who's a PhD in Semitic languages, also presented on why and how Ancient Aliens and their ETH ilk gets it wrong. In his 2010 final events in the secret government group of demonic UFOs in the afterlife, the picture here, there, get an idea what that's about. Redfern weaves together a complicated story of the connections between ufology, the occult, Western esotericism, and the development of America's space program. Redfern's project began when he met and interviewed Ray Bosch, an Anglican priest who claimed to have been recruited into the Collins Elite, which was a secret group within the government tasked to find the truth about UFOs. Speaking to Redfern, Bosch related that, quote, they came to believe that NHEs, non-human extra, I don't, what the E was, I think NHIs, non-human intelligences, sorry, were not extraterrestrial at all. I'm sorry, non-human entities were not extraterrestrial at all. They believed they were some sort of demonic entities, end quote, and that the DoD wanted to communicate with them, the Department of Defense. Through various conversations, Bosch learned that they believed, quote, the human race was being deceived into believing that it was receiving visitations from aliens when in reality, demonic forces were secretly squaring up for Armageddon and the final countdown, end quote. Later, he adds, this is Bosch talking to Redfern, I can't come to any other conclusion than there is some sort of spiritual deception going on here. And so many of these kinds of alien contacts, the entities involved make a denial of Christianity. Anytime the spiritual issues are addressed, there's always some sort of denial of the validity of Christianity and the validity of the Bible, end quote. ETs seem to go out of their way, according to Bosch, to discredit Christianity. Redfern, the hard-boiled journalist, wonders, quote, might the demonic theory actually be a cover story to steer people away from the extraterrestrial angle? Is this all part of some deceitful and nefarious plot to have us believe that hostile demonic forces are lining up for the final battle, one that will result in the careful ushering in of a new world order driven and controlled by an overwhelming fear of non-existent fallen angels, bogus hate-filled demons, and a fictional antichrist? On the other hand, if the overall story of the Collins elite is absolutely true, then we may be in for some very turbulent times, end quote. You know, reading Redfern and ufology literature can be a bit disorienting due to rhetorical strategies, especially ones that seek to bring about some kind of synchronicity in the reader's mind instead of chastened inferences made on the basis of detailed and specific evidence framed by a coherent argument. The presenting of information, mainly a narrative, interspersed with commentary. Why me? Why was I chosen to report this? It only adds to its lack of perspicuity. The standard logic seems to be repetitive suggestion is as good as proof, and put enough things that are apparently similar side by side, and eventually textual correlation becomes historical causation. It is no wonder then that Michael Heiser, that I mentioned earlier, wanting to reach a broader audience than biblical scholars or Roswell conference attendees, codified his intuitions in his novel, The Facade, that blurs the lines between fact and fiction. In his blurb for the book, Chris Putnam, another evangelical author, I need to move my slide here, another evangelical author, he writes, quote, it is not only prescient in its analysis, it might turn out to be true. Remember, this is a fictional book we're talking about. The book falls into the genre, this is what he's saying in the blurb here. The book falls into the genre of faction because it contains as much fact as fiction, end quote. Guy Malone, mentioned earlier, who organizes the Roswell's conference, the parallel conferences, notes that, quote, the novelization of what is likely going on in all those underground bases is probably the closest to the truth to ever see print. The research is simply astounding. My only concern is that Heiser too close to the truth and will be X-file before publishing, end quote. The cover proudly claims that all the historical documents referenced or reproduced in the text are all real. So here we have moved into the realm of the hyper-real, where fact and fiction and truth and story all blend together to create apologetic propaganda for a demonized ufology. However, Heiser is able to add his own creative element to the modern mythology. Unlike Jagger's cherubim or Lindsay and Redfern's demons, Heiser's daemonology in the novel is more nuanced. It's grounded in his training in ancient Near Eastern culture and languages. Within his sharply defined dualistic worldview, there are spiritual non-human entities of the IDH pulling the strings behind the material extraterrestrials. In the book, they are reptilian-like, but super-material, immaterial, and have conspired with elements in the US government to use the grays, the material alien made famous on Strieber's Communion, the almond eyes and the skin, to prove ETH. Quoting the Bible and drawing on other pseudepigraphal writings and the Book of Enoch, the novel begins with some exposition about the origin of demons as the immortal souls of hybrid creatures created when quasi-divine beings known as watchers intermingled with humans. These bastard kids, the sons of gods and daughters of men, were destroyed in the Great Flood, but their souls endure. Together, the leftover watchers and their disembodied offspring are waiting for the right time to deceive humanity and take revenge against God. Heiser's prologue here maps directly onto what he promotes in his lectures and other books, his other nonfiction books, like The Unseen Realm and Reversing Herman. Thus linked, the rest of the novel proceeds to speculate what that historical narrative trajectory might look like today under the rubric of the UFO phenomenon. And while Heiser is not the first to link ancient deities with UFOs, he is the first, as far as I can tell, to do so within what he calls the divine council worldview and as an evangelical. I only have about a minute left. I'll finish this. Briefly, the novel is a first in a trilogy that follows Dr. Brian Scott, who is recruited to join a group a lot like the Collins elite. Once secreted away in an underground military base, Scott meets other recruits from various backgrounds, including a Catholic priest. As the novel progresses, they are increasingly exposed to what the military knows about UFOs and also discover that there is another group within the military cooperating with the aliens. Towards that end, after a series of misadventures and murders, Scott sees through the facade. The aliens are not ETs after all. And in one scene along this journey, the Catholic priest, Father Andrew, brings Scott and the main female protagonist, Dr. Melissa Kelly, and the readers up to speed on the eschatological nature of the UFO phenomenon. This is Father Andrew speaking. I tried to inform some of my superiors in the church years ago of my suspicions. But most of them laughed, enamored as they were by their anti-supernatural modernistic theology. I misunderstood Matthew 24, they said. I couldn't take Genesis 6 literally. I should disregard Enoch as containing anything of value. Watchers were myth, they argued. Astral prophecy was a deception. What's this about astral prophecy, Melissa asked? Do you believe that the second coming will be signaled by some kind of astronomical event? Yes, I believe that, but I don't know if his ideas about astral prophecy and appearing of the Messiah. It's too complicated to get into now. All I can say now is that the Talmud contains the idea that the Pleiades and the two horns of Taurus are related to the revived house of Joseph and the appearance of the Messiah. What's especially alarming about the idea is that the Pleiades not only plays a role in the messianic appearing, but Jewish rabbis universally connect the constellation to the flood event, and what we know happened then with the Watchers. You know, the Pleiades are an important part of UFO lore too. They're important astronomical events related to all this coming soon, and the convergence of these things troubles me. In a rather bewildering hodgepodge of citations and gestures, Heiser takes down liberal theology, raises the authority of non-canonical text and the Talmud for Christian readers, and ties it all together with astronomy and the second coming. This cornucopia of possibilities clearly steers the reader towards Heiser's other text and work. In a way, we've come full circle. Look at that. That's awesome. In a way, we've come full circle. What started out as angels warning of judgment in the sky has now become satanic hordes hoping to jumpstart Armageddon. The messaging is clear. America must repent and recognize the signs of the times in the UFO phenomenon. As a meta-narrative, demonize ufology easily that unseen entities are pulling the strings of the enemy in the ongoing culture wars. In a way, the evangelical responses to UFOs presented in this paper are emblematic, if not prophetic, of the developments within the American church in recent months. Once ET and Satan get together to plot the end of the world, QAnon seems like a respectable source.
Thank you, Benjamin. Nice connecting to the previous paper. All right, so we will have Catherine Pulley presenting next. She'll be presenting Runner Available, Perception and Verisimilitude in the World of Tanis. And Catherine received her BA in English Literature with a minor in Linguistics from Metropolitan State University of Denver in 2015. She was the president of Sigma Tau Delta Honor Society in 2015 and received first place and runner-up awards at their 2016 International Convention. She currently puts her close reading and writing skills to use in the legal industry and embraces independent scholarship around compelling stories as often as possible.
Thank you. So I wanted to kind of first talk about how I got into this topic and the podcast that I kind of analyzed for this project, which is called Tanis. So as we all went through last year, 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, conspiracy theories were just everywhere. They're just running rampant in our society. And, you know, even within kind of my own circle, I saw one friend in particular just becoming so convinced about, you know, the truth of these unsubstantiated claims, from, you know, voter fraud to how COVID-19 to even, you know, QAnon, and just completely was blown away by how bizarre it all was. And at the same time, how strongly my friend felt about, you know, these these ideas. And it really just led me to the question, how could this happen? How did someone, who I know, really get led to these beliefs? And kind of in my downtime, have habit of listening to podcasts, both kind of literary or narrative fiction ones, and investigative or journalistic more type productions. Things like a really famous one is called Dr. Death, a story of a nefarious doctor. And I ended up at Tanis really just because I liked the name of the podcast and didn't know anything about what it was about. Read that it was a continuous narrative, kind of mystery horror format. It was produced in 2015, so kind of way before the current cultural climate. And through listening to this production, it really became clear to me how those ideas could be embraced. The conspiracy theory in our real world, because this show presented a theory that they really put a lot into making it seem real. And as I was listening to it, I had to really research some of the content, because there are so many allusions to historical events, historical figures, people, and pop culture. They kind of tie the story into so many things that I'd kind of heard about before, some things that I knew were real, some things that no one has really been able to figure out. And it really gave me insight into how conspiracy theories can form, and also had some tie-ins with, one of the biggest mysteries in our world, which is there anything out there other than us? So my first impression of this kind of production was, wow, it's a thrilling mystery. The host is presented as this real employee of the production company, Pacific Northwest Stories. And he kind of sets out in search of this idea of the last great mystery. In the internet age, is there anything out there that has no website, no public record, no recorded history? Are there any genuine mysteries left in the world? So kind of that was the hook, the draw in of the narrative and the plot of this production. And it starts out referencing something that's been briefly touched on already here, with talking about the initial development of rocket science, and a rocket scientist in particular, Jack Parsons, who was doing experiments in California, created a lot of innovation in that industry, but of course also had these somewhat nefarious connections to the world of the occult. He was connected with L. Ron Hubbard, their shared lover, who was named Sarah. Oh, lost my place. Sarah Parsons, was a kind of muse to both of these guys as they were participating in Aleister Crowley's Ordo Templar Orientis. So Jack Parsons doing rocket science by day and doing sex magic rituals by night. And the plot of the story kind of starts out with the discovery of a short story in a kind of mysterious magazine called Strange Worlds, that only one edition was ever released. And this short story called Where is Tanis is the kind of core of this investigation. And I will kind of put the short story linked into the comments in just a moment here. But they talked about how Parsons was and it was indeed in real life, a writer, kind of a hack writer from within the circle of these, community out there. And the narrator, Nick Silver, investigates how it didn't really seem like it matched, like this story matched up with any of the styles of Parsons' other writing, and kind of came to this idea: where did this story really come from? So as the narrative continues, I'm not going to follow it too quickly in case anyone wants to actually check out this podcast, but it continues to allude to historical figures, pop culture, and also a lot of found manuscripts, a lot of found recordings that kind of pop up throughout the narrative. And the producers link all of these documents to the website. So all of the listeners can actually go on and look at pictures of the things that are being described in here, look at, listen to some of these recordings, see these email chains that get uncovered. And they really, Nick Silver, the narrator, really wants to dive into this myth of Tanis. Tanis being a very mysterious and like unreconcilable event, maybe alternate dimension. It's talked about as a person here and there. One of the interviews that they reference is with a doctor who is a fictional person, but they talked about him as if he was a real person, and that they had interviewed him for a previous production that was never aired by their company because what he talked about wasn't verifiable, and of talking about this idea of Tanis. And so the narrator kind of describes it as this: Tanis as mystery, maybe one of the last pure mysteries left in the world, one last chance to be truly surprised. I'm talking about the Freemasons, the Templars, the Illuminati, and the Doukhobors, about the deep web Tor browsers and black sites. I'm talking about old VHS tapes passed from college dorms to conspiracy nuts and brownies, notes surreptitiously left in old phone books, and stories told over decades via classified ads. I'm talking about whispers in the dark, standing next to a stranger waiting for a subway train in the middle of the night. One word: Tanis. So, our narrator Nick kind of goes on to investigate this, and in that process has the need for more research than he can do on himself. So he meets and employs a information specialist, who we would call a hacker, to help find connections, any mention online of what this thing they're calling Tanis might be. And she at one point says to him, well, what you're looking for maybe pre-digital. And he says, I have no idea what I'm looking for. So I thought that was a very interesting moment, in that it really displays that susceptibility that we've kind of touched on already. This lack of direction in the research, and also a willingness to believe that these connections, these threads, these small correlations can equal causation. And the hacker, who they call MK, is much more skeptical, wants to rely on evidence, has all of these tools that allow her to pull up cached text records from the internet that were deleted in like milliseconds of being posted. She can retrieve this information that the everyday people, us, including the listener, don't have access to. So she kind of continues to add these little pieces of things that could be potentially connected to the core of the story, and the chain just grows. And it's built around bizarre events that have been observed in the last 100 years or so in a specific area of the Pacific Northwest. But there are threads to many different events and phenomena around the world. So kind of as the story progresses, the narrator, Nick, draws attention to himself in this search because, as it turns out, there are other factions and organizations out there that are also aware of this story, this idea of Tanis. And it has an allure because there have been stories of people experiencing healing of illnesses without any explanation, finding, artistic inspiration that, seems, very, very unusual to the character of those persons. And the narrative kind of just continues by making these connections with not only events, but people that show up, characters that become involved in the story. And their connections are revealed through their own statements, through interviews that the narrator conducts, as if he were, in fact, investigating this phenomenon. And then as the story goes on, there are events that actually play out. So the narrator, Nick, goes to these places and experiences these very bizarre events, disappearances, receiving cryptic messages or artifacts, and the mystery just builds. And I related this to UFO religion in that, Scientology has been discussed as a UFO religion, specifically by Gregory Reese in his book, UFO Religions and Culture, as it discusses kind of these ideas of what is the origin of human life, what happens in the afterlife, is there some kind of circular process there? And I like the contrast of looking at organizations like that and contrasting them with the idea of researchers, scientific researchers, which are also present in the story, that, there are biological phenomena in the story that are popping up, and a very mysterious kind of pseudo-government agency shows up and says, well, Nick, do you want to come work for us? You can measure some of the anomalies that we're seeing in this area. And part of the story for me kind of gave an insight into the tone of this production, where this narrator, who's supposed to be, just kind of open-minded and neutral and as far as trying to uncover the real truth of this, ends up going and working with this government organization that has more resources, more data, more everything, but they have their own, agenda in figuring out, even if they don't really want to reveal it. And I find that for us, especially like millennials, in my opinion, we have this kind of anxiety about, do we have the resources to do it? Am I, going to be able to continue to pay my rent or, put gas in my car while pursuing this thing that's, I'm really passionate about? And so like the organization of this government agency kind of makes that possible and makes Nick's further investigation possible, even though it kind of compromises his neutrality. So the narrator definitely gets caught up in this conspiracy theory, and he participates in little bits of both, the scientific method and another group that's present that's kind of like more of a cult religion based around this idea of Tanis, that, there's a an entity that they're trying to connect with for their own benefit. And then in the middle is Nick kind of trying to find this truth. And I read a short article by a medical doctor named Richard Friedman that kind of talks about why we become vulnerable to these conspiracy theories. And it's exactly what the narrator Nick is participating in. Friedman says, we have evolved to quickly detect patterns and understand how events in our world might be casually related to each other. Our tendency also makes the cognitive errors, such as seeing connections between events where none exist. In fact, people who tend to see meaningful design in random events or stimuli are much more likely to endorse conspiracy theories than are those with less of this tendency, a bias, it turns out, we can be educated to resist. And, of course, I'd say part of that education is engaging in logic and kind of reason and, Occam's razor, all that, those kind of activities. But that study can really only take us so far, because there are things that science is not able to explain. And this podcast really just gives you a huge list, a huge kind of what those situations can look like. And there in the story is also a relation to the Native American tribe of the region, which is called the Haida. And they have a lot of oral traditions that speak to this myth of Tanis that allude to it, that, they call it something else, but their descriptions are very similar to some of the experiences that Nick has had. So I also see then the Native American aspect as having both kind of the religious perspective on it, but also the observational and somewhat like scientific experience of being in this area for longer than anyone else, having, an oral history that talks about things that happened hundreds of years ago that no one else can really speak to. So I wanted to kind of talk about how the podcast really made me understand more how conspiracy theories can come about. And a big reliance in the production is on technology. Not only that, web research that MK undertakes, searching the dark web, but also, the laboratory stuff that they uncover in the story, and also the technological ability to conceal a lot of things, whether that's deleting records or having voice processing that makes the origin of an interview really hard to discern because it's encrypted, or even things like VPNs taking away the ability to track location. So I think technology really can build our knowledge and the resources there, but it also has the ability to cut out and increase the mystery of those just the mystery. So that leads to, I think, our identity in the 21st century, both of the characters in the podcast and for us ourselves as listeners. It makes things much more uncertain. It's hard to say, is this real, or is this something that someone just dreamed up and put a website, created a website to make it seem real, which is what the producers of this podcast have done. So as Dr. Freeman said, we become susceptible to seeing these phenomena as plausible through not only an appeal to authority of scientists or researchers or, the traditions of Native people, but also just the rhetoric, the delivery of that information via media, via reporting, which as a culture we have kind of, up to a point, come to consider truthful, that we want to place our trust in. And I think that really comes back to that idea of the repetitive suggestion as good as truth. If you see something on the news enough times, even if it's completely illogical, they're talking about it on the radio. Isn't it worth looking into? Isn't there something worth investigating there? So kind of my last part that I wanted to touch on was how Tanis as a podcast utilizes this format to facilitate audience participation and even contribution to the story. As I mentioned before, on the podcast website, they have an extensive notes section that goes episode by episode, with pictures and stories and email chains and, kind of references back to, Tesla's laboratory, or wow, when Charles Manson was like being transported, he went through this area and he was never quite the same after that. And just a lot of allusions. And I think that really can draw people in because, as I mentioned, there are a lot of aspects of that are historically accurate, or at least happened at some point in time. And not only that, the producers invite the listeners to call in and, leave messages for them to say, what do you think about Tanis? Where is Tanis? What is it? And they're played like in kind of the intermission of the podcast. So you really get to hear these real people that are just like you, kind of putting their perspective in there and saying, well, I was on a hike and a plane flew over me, right over me, but then it disappeared and I was never able to find any record of it. Or, what if this, what if that? So I think that aspect really not only contributes to the mystery, but it just contributes to the idea of subjectivity in these experiences that, especially when we're alone, which I think is what a lot of the observers of UFO events have kind of been in the experience, is like seeing something when you're by yourself and you don't have any kind of anyone else to verify that what you're saying happened. And just, it really builds the lore of that. And another way that they kind of draw this in is having this narrator who is played by the main producer of the show, Terry Miles. But they have the narrator, Nick Silver, present himself as the cousin of Terry Miles. And they've even had this narrator do like AMAs on Reddit, like talking about the show and how they're putting the show together as if he were a real person, when in fact he's not. But the continuity and just the commitment to that kind of idea just brings you in and creates what I think of as kind of a modern incarnation of that, really classic, Martian invasion, H.G. Wells kind of questioning, especially, of course, when decades later, Orson Welles created a War of the Worlds. Thank you. War of the Worlds radio broadcasts that, the reports of this are, I guess, not as drastic as people once thought, but people heard this story on the radio and there were some reports of panic, people thinking that there were really Martians happening, like invading the Earth, because it was on the radio. So again, it's kind of that, appeal to authority that is potentially misplaced in our modern media. But kind of in closing, and kind of thinking about, the motives of this production as, presenting this one last great mystery versus, how conspiracy buffs really operate in this world. I think that it's the most fictionalized part of the podcast is kind of that pursuit of this, exciting mystery, which is always, brings people in. But what usually with mysteries, there's no answer, there's no definitive result. And same in the real world. What really draws people to conspiracy theories, I think, is kind of pursuing that feeling of superiority through being privy to this, these ideas or this circumstance or event that no one else is really aware of, this kind of wokeness within our culture that, that idea that we have insight into, something that not many people do really appeals to our ego.
I think you should let the last presenter present, if you would.
Yes,
So.
that's perfect, because that was the end.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Our last presenter will be Zita Babarchi, who will be presenting a paper, Conspiracies of Desire and the Vindicated Conspiracy Theorist in Philip K. Dick's Time Out of Joint. And Zita is a third-year PhD candidate based at the University of Stirling, funded by the Carnegie Trust. Her thesis focuses on conspiracy narratives in popular fiction as they reflect, process, or subvert the topic of gender from the late 1950s to the present day.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen, and please let me know if you can see it properly. And full screen. Yes? Yes, great. Hi, thank you so much. It's great to be here, even as, I'm sorry, my cat is taking over. Come on. So it's great to be here, even if here is just my bedroom. My name is Zita Babarchi, and I'm very grateful and excited to be here. And thank you for the organizers and both Kenneth and Greg. Just let me run through it all. Right. The way I structure this talk is as follows. I will talk a little bit about myself and my thesis. I will talk about, I will introduce the plot of Time Out of Joint, because in a very Dickian fashion, it's not at all straightforward. Then I will cover the main topics of my talk, which are, why do I think Time Out of Joint is a landmark piece of conspiracy narrative? Second, what does masculinity have to do with conspiracy? And I will also address why should we care about this today. So I said, I'm a postgraduate researcher at the University of Stirling. I'm just starting my third and hopefully final year. My thesis can be described as popular fiction meets conspiracy meets gender. And the scope of my research is American fiction from the late 1950s, starting with Time Out of Joint, in fact, to the present day. It is in this framework I read Philip K. Dick's book, and it is the perspective I would like to talk about today. Time, I argue, exemplifies a specific kind of conspiracy narrative which is rooted in highly gendered conceptions of the self and its place in a conspiratorial world. I have two main aims with this talk. One is to put Dick's novel on the map, so to speak. And in this talk, I hope to show that time is a unique and uniquely lucid example of conspiracy fiction, and one which have been probably unfairly neglected by scholars of conspiracy fiction. My second aim is to showcase through the example of this book just how integral and inherent masculinity and concepts of masculinity is to mid-century concepts, mid-century American concepts of conspiracy. But before all that, let's showcase the plot. So the novel's focal character is Regal Gum. He's a middle-aged everyman in a very sleepy 1950s American suburban town. Gum earns his living by participating in a newspaper contest, which is called Where Will the Little Green Man Be Next, which also works as a tongue twister. Anyway, by the middle of the novel, Gum starts to suspect there is a conspiracy and that he is at the center of this conspiracy. Soon, along with Gum, we learn the following things. His entire suburb is an elaborate fake populated by brainwashed agents. It is in fact 1998, not the 1950s. Earth is at war with colonists from the moon. The newspaper contest, which Gum participates in, predicts lunar missile strikes and is in fact national importance. And the government learned that Gum was preparing to defect to the lunar side, which is why they constructed this entire facade. Eventually, Gum escapes the fake suburban town called the Old Town, locates his lunar agent, fully recovers his memories, and is invited on a rocket ship which is headed for Luna. Here, the novel rather abruptly ends. So why is a land? Peter Knight argues that the Kennedy assassination introduced conspiratoriality into the mainstream of American thought and discourse. He writes, following the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 in particular, conspiracy theories have become a regular feature of everyday political and cultural life, not so much an occasional outburst, but part and parcel of many people's normal way of thinking about who they are and how the world works. In fact, I created this very helpful chart. All of the men have subheadings on their Wikipedia page titled Conspiracy Theories About Death. So published in 1959, Time Out of Joint predates this moment, which Knight shows is a watershed moment. Time's position in American conspiracy literature allows Dick to use the literary device of conspiracy in a uniquely lucid, unapologetic, and ontologically stable fashion. When I say unapologetic, I mean free of the cultural baggage which attaches itself to the idea of conspiracy during and after the 60s. This is evident in just how easily Regal Gum adopts the position of the conspired against subject. Up until Gum finds proof of the conspiracy, he's going insane. And let me just read from the book. He says, I must be crazy, he said to himself. Infantile and lunatic. What am I doing sitting here? Daydreams at best, fantasies about rocket ships shooting by overhead, armies and conspiracies. Paranoia. A paranoiac psychosis, imagining that I'm the center of a vast effort by millions of men and women involving billions of dollars and infinite work, the universe revolving around me. This is a common trope of conspiracy narratives where the protagonist experiences an internal struggle where they have to reconcile that their self-image, their place in the world as they've known it up until this point, with the egotism, which is very much inherent in the position of the conspiracy theorist or the conspired against subject. In Time Out of Joint, this internal tussle lasts fewer than a few pages. In fact, within the same scene from which I've just read, Gum overhears pilots talking about the famous Rigel Gum himself, and thereby he gains confirmation that there is indeed a conspiracy against him and he is not crazy at all. Just to put this self-doubt in perspective, I'd like to compare time with another novel, which is funnily got very relevant with the mention of the tennis. Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin came out 7 years after time and is most known through the movie adaptation. In Levin's book, Rosemary spends 20 out of the 22 chapters in excruciating self-doubt before she finally allows herself to believe that she is in fact a victim of the conspiracy. Compare this to time where I've said Dick absolves his hero from self-doubt within a few paragraphs by the middle of the book. This is what I mean when I say unapologetic. This ease with which Gum occupies the epistemological position of the conspiracy theorist. This eager embracing is one way in which time becomes a conspiracy of desire. Living in a conspiracy is desirable compared to the thought of going insane or even living in the suburbs. Of course, Gum's attitude is also influenced by gender. Gum channels suburban masculinity in crisis. He does not have the markings of suburban male success and is very conscious of this fact. At one point, he dismays. Stunning desolation washed over him. What a waste his life has been. Here he was, 46, fiddling around in the living room with a newspaper contest. No gainful, legitimate employment, no kids, no wife, no home of his own, fooling around with a neighbor's wife. No career, family, or no suburban home signals deep failings as a suburban man. And yet he scorns Bill Black, his more successful in this environment, more successful neighbor, for Bill Black's conformity. Thinking about him, Gum uses how he is eager to be part of some colossal machine and how Black sets out every day, sets up on foot, not in his car, striding optimistically along in his single-breasted suit. The conformity baked into the structure of suburbia thus becomes a double bind for Gum. He yearns for the acceptance conformity would bring for him, but at the same time mocks the values and the rituals which would allow him to attain this status. The conspiracy offers Gum a way out of his double bind. The existence of the conspiracy allows Gum to step into a different tradition of masculinity. The second half of the novel is an exploration of this other masculinity, well represented in the American tradition, which Timothy Malley calls the masculinist version of liberal individualism. In this tradition, freedom means to be separate from the domestic sphere and protected from a technologically invasive society. And so Gum's escape from the conspiracy becomes an escape from domesticity as well. In fact, it is only by rediscovering and honing a self-reliant, non-conformist masculinity, one that is entirely incompatible with suburban domesticity, that Gum manages to escape. Tellingly, the strategy which proves to be successful is teaming up with his brother-in-law and stealing a truck. We can see here male homosocial bonding, living on the edges of the law, and of course the thrill of the road, which links this text to that monolith of 60s culture, indeed counterculture, Kerouac's On the Road. Oh. Sorry. So these masculine crises are another way in which Dick's novel can be called a conspiracy of desire. Instead of struggling in a suburban milieu, which he both looks down upon and is excluded from, Gum is given permission, indeed a mandate by the existence of the conspiracy to become a different man. This state of affairs removes the anxiety of non-performance or underperformance he experienced in his original milieu And so the masculinity he discovers through his engagement with the conspiracy becomes a more preferable, more desirable, more masculine state of being. For conclusions, there are troubling implications of finding masculine self-fulfillment in the participation via the participation in a conspiracy. For one, I think it encourages a kind of unbridled egotism, which rarely leads to positive results in real life. In fact, I see traces of Gumb's narrative DNA, if you will, in the Pizzagate gunman incident of 2016, during which, if you don't know by any chance or don't remember, the man threatened staff and guests at the Comet Ping Pong Pizza Parlor, which some thought to be a front to child trafficking underground organization. The other troubling implication, one other troubling implication, is it leads to the question that what does this epistemological position leave for the rest of us? In this conspiratorial worldview of time out of joint, women are restricted to one-dimensional upholders of the status quo or stepping stones towards mere self-fulfillment. This rather utilitarian view of women is very evident in a paragraph just after Gum, just before Gum recruits his brother-in-law to his cause and before they steal a truck together. Let me read the account. I want you to look at something. The big tall girl in the black sweater, the girl with the chest. Don't you think you could solve your problems better in that direction than by anything else? Liz is intelligent. At least she's got more on the ball than Junie Black. She's certainly attractive, and she's not married. You have got enough money, and you're famous enough to interest her. The rest is up to you. I don't think it would help, Regal said. And this is the moment the brother-in-law is finally convinced and recruited to the cause. So originally, I wanted to close this talk by pointing out that gender roles in the 50s and 60s, as far as they're truthfully represented in the fiction, have been certainly more extreme, more rigid, and more sharply divided than they are today. After all, Time was published only a few years before Feminine Mystique and before the second wave of feminism has kicked off in earnest. The social changes achieved by feminists since have opened up many roles for women, including, for good or ill, that of the conspiracy theorist. I wanted to point to the numerous women who participated in the Capitol riots this January, including I think the only fatal victim to die of a gunshot. And how fertile ground for anti-vaccine sentiments years before the pandemic. However, and this is an anecdote I would like to share. A few weeks ago, I reconnected with an old friend of mine who dropped off the radar for a while, and I became somewhat worried about him. But I reconnected, but he was unfortunately in a bad mood. He was very angry about how, according to some news sites he reads, critical race theory is mounting an attack on biology and the life sciences and well, everything that's good in the world. By listening to him, I disagreed, and I suggested he weans himself off of those news sites for his own sake for a bit. He felt insulted, and we parted ways under very bad terms that day. I relayed this story to many people because I was very frustrated. The reactions from my female friends were either incredulity, sympathy, or sort of a generalized fatigue. A male friend, however, blurted out something interesting. He said, I believe, at least half joking, I think your Paul needs to make a profile on Tinder. at that moment, I had terrible deja vu to the time out of joint, and there is a reason I left up this particular paragraph from the book. So maybe we haven't moved on from the 60s that much after all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zita, and to all the presenters. Thank you. I think there's so many interesting kind of points of connection here, and a lot of different I know perspectives on how we might contextualize these ideas. Just something that occurred to me, and of course, if anyone out there has any questions, you can put them into the chat. But I wonder if maybe the presenters could speak to the idea of conspiracy and UFOs as well as kind of a form, somewhat of a form of that. Is the ultimate goal of these narratives, is it understanding, do you think, or is it escape? Is it control, or perhaps maybe merely coping with this kind of a generation of information outside of what is the officially accepted sensibility? So anyone who would like to jump in on that, or if you have any other kind of take where you see like points of commonality, that would be interesting.
I don't think that. Yeah, I think there are a lot of fractured a lot of fractured fragmentary narratives, right? And there's competing meta narratives that emerge, and I think that's part of the. But at the same time, as the postmodern suspicion of any meta narrative, it's kind of like the one that can gain the most followers at any point, right? Like who can present the slickest kind of connection to different things that are relevant at any given point. But then at the same time, I think there's a longing for some kind of transcendent purpose beyond the materialistic neoliberal economy that we all exist in too. And I'm thinking of Philip K. Dick's experience with Valis that comes along later, right? The pink beam that like zaps his brain, and he writes this 200,000 word exegesis or something. Like, I mean, that's probably as close to being abducted by a sci-fi writer as you could get, right? So, I mean, what was that all about? I guess that was 20 something years later after Time Is Out of Joint, but. Yeah, I find that there seems to be something, and this is what led Jacques Vallée and some of these other writers. There's something out there that's messing with humans that's more than just humans. I mean, call it the collective unconscious or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I think there is this. Maybe it's the emergent property of humanity. I don't know, but something that's keeps promoting these things and spitting them out. That's beyond our. It's the TANUS. It's beyond our ability to kind of articulate. It's on the. Or as Flannery O'Connor said, like Jesus, haunting the trees, the ragged figured in the back of our minds, that kind of thing. Anyway, just some rambling thoughts. Philip K. Dick thought.
Yeah, and kind of just to expand on that, Benjamin, I think that kind of design experience, or maybe even trying to kind of cope with it, as Dr. Hough says, it is about control to me, feeling that you have some sort of, if not, direct control, at least understanding that makes us feel more in control, even though there may not really be a direct path for me.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to theorize in conspiracies, and I was never really fond of the paranoid way of theorizing them. I'm more drawn to the seeing them as a response to some sort of generalized anxiety. And what I don't see mentioned often whenever conspiracies are discussed, either in the media or by academics, is how much more fun these stories are. Like, it's not only that they are easily accessible, or maybe they are more truthful. I think that's sometimes sort of secondary, because what's thinking about UFOs or thinking about the lizard people pulling the strings behind, I don't know, Hillary Clinton's and the blood drinking thing. It's so much more exciting than thinking it's all just people sitting around desks and pushing papers and drinking like still water. It's just so much more fun.
And I can say, because I had a different kind of angle from the psychiatry, that they were searching for, at least Dr. Mack, he wanted to find understanding, he wanted to find truth in the world, and he wanted to understand the world better. And that's, I think, what interested him in it. But also, to answer kind of the question of the chat over there about trauma, is I can tell you again from my angle, not from anybody else's, that that is one thing that they definitely looked into. And one thing that Dr. Mack himself said, and all the people, he found that there was trauma that they were all dealing with, but he said, well, of course there was. They were abducted by aliens. So that's what the trauma was. So he did say that they all had trauma, and in his definition, that trauma was an obvious thing of having been abducted. But I mean, outside, if you don't believe they're actually abducted, then you have to think the trauma came from somewhere else. So that might be what you're saying a little bit, and could go on, that there is trauma involved.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and really does connect to what Zita said about them being more fun, where, you know, whereas we don't really think of a trauma response as being something that's fun, but it is maybe at least equally as stark and just confronting to someone who has experienced trauma that kind of has, you know, their world has changed. And so they're looking for a changed world or a changed explanation that relates to what's happened to them.
I think Michael Barkin has his text on this, his work on this is really interesting. If I forget the name of it, it's A Culture of Conspiracies or something, Michael Barkin. He has several chapters. He connects in almost a conspiratorial fashion, he connects all these different conspiracies, but underneath this rubric of mainstreaming the fringe. And he was writing all this stuff before the internet. So, I mean, some of the stuff in there, you're reading it, you're like, okay, yeah. And then now you see it, and it's, man, this guy, he had a crystal ball. An incredible piece. Yeah, that's it. Yep, Culture of Conspiracy. Really good book.
Well, yes, to me, I mean, all of these papers kind of speak to the idea that this is at one point it might have been a fringe idea, but it's almost like an accepted part of the culture now. One of the presenters talking about how Zita, I think, was mentioning that it's in the Wikipedia page of so many of these important leaders, you know, just that we have to at least grapple with the idea that there are conspiracy theories about their deaths, or about, you know, their I guess the way that they were in the world in some ways. So that's a really kind of fascinating thing. And then what do you do with that when you know that, you know, that this isn't actual history, or that it is highly, you know, problematic, and that the, you know, the evidence or whatever evidence that you're presenting isn't necessarily accepted as such. And yet, you know, it's almost like the coin of the realm in some ways, you know, the way that we have to understand that these theories, that these beliefs, that these perspectives exist, and then maybe that we are, okay, gets beholden to them to a certain extent. Yeah. So we have gone over a little bit. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to stay in the session, but I do know that there are other sessions going on. Any last comments or anything that we want to say before we get on our spaceships and leave? Well,
I think have comments and questions to everybody else, but if we are that much over, I just probably message everyone.
I mean, I think it's fine if we have some last statements or comments. That it seems like people are still hanging out a little bit, so because it's quite an interesting discussion. So yeah.
I do recommend going to Roswell for the anniversary, or have a festival every year. It's a really interesting place. And getting to talk to like Travis Walton,
Oh,
I mean, how many people can say you've met people that claim abduction? Yeah. So, yeah, it's a really, really neat, and they have all sorts of different, they got the people that are, these are nuts and bolts, and they're from outer space. They fly like this. And then they got the people, they're like, no, they're demons. And then you got the people that they're interdimensional. And then you have the people, the abductees that are talking. I mean, it's just a hodgepodge of just this great mix of humanity.
yeah. Growing up in a military family, it was almost kind of like I don't know, like the tall tales of the Air Force were these, everybody had them. All of the flyers that my father knew, had these stories that they would tell at parties. It wasn't, official, and they almost never reported them because of that. But it was also something. It's like, who's got the best UFO story in some way? So it feels like it's part of so many different cultures, so many different perspectives, definitely, and international, of course, but then also Roswell, has this kind of a religious site almost to it, I suppose.
Yeah, it's like a pilgrimage, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and I find it really fascinating that a lot of those, stories that, we've all kind of heard from people over the years, that there's now that, like FBI released documents that do, talk about these, pilots or, military experience with unidentified, flying objects out there. So, things do happen, and we don't always hear about it or have, access to that information right away. But now, decades later, we do. So I don't think that conspiracy theories are ever going to stop, because there's always that question of what are we not being told about?
Sure. Well, and then also them being embraced to a certain extent now by the military. When I was talking about is like the 70s and 80s, when this was, you can't talk about that. But now we have, the military, naval personalities coming out and saying, that we don't know what it is, but we have to talk about it. There has to be more research. So interesting that it's becoming less fringe, like I said, and more kind of just another aspect of cultural perspective. There are some questions about what books or podcasts or whatnot would you recommend for people who want to go beyond what we've talked about today?
Yeah, there's a great podcast called Weird Studies, and they cover all sorts of stuff. They've done on Philip K. Dick. They've done I think one of the guys is like he's a professor, a musicologist, I believe, and the other one is a writer. But they take everything esoteric, but they do it from a very academic kind of point of view. In a way that is like the verisimilitude that you were talking about, Catherine and Tanis. You're like, are they really believing this, or is this just something they're like, where is this? But it's a great podcast. It's a good community too. They've got a Discord that you can pop in and post chats on there on all sorts of stuff. Yeah, and trying to answer the question, I mean, ufology is so big, it's hard to nail down.
There was a book a few years ago, and I think they made a documentary, but I preferred the book called Mirage Men, which was a pretty good kind of a look at this, and then the use of UFO narratives potentially for disinformation or just disruption. So almost maybe the realization that there is a power there, but that you can use it for ulterior motives in some ways, which of course is what a lot of these subcultures have kind of tapped into as well too. Yeah. And
there was what was it called, the 29th parallel? Was it 29th or 39th?
The idea that
Ehrenreich.
Different sites where sightings and whatnot have occurred are all like somehow on these the connected line.
But it has the ley lines, or it has like 15 the bulk of it, I'm trying to remember the name of it, is about cattle mutilations. Now that's something that that gets really strange quick.
Sure.
if you start looking into cattle mutilations. I can't remember the name of the book though. My brother and I once made crop circles next to our local airport just to see if anybody would report it.
Right. You know, there is
Boards
that.
and everything.
There is definitely that aspect of wanting to play, right? Wanting to play in this kind of, you know, idea. I do remember someone in my hometown setting off a balloon, like a helium balloon, with the idea of trying to spoof a UFO. And I think it caused us some consternation with the FAA. So yeah. Mm.
It's the 37th parallel. That's the name of it.
37th parallel. Yeah.
The secret truth behind UFOs, America's UFO highway. That's the name of it. Yeah. These are uncritical. The ones that were Mirage Men's uncritical, 37th parallel are uncritical.
Yeah.
Interrupted Journey's uncritical, and Strieber's uncritical. Fiona, between Christianity and these studies. Well, I'm a religion scholar, well, English, but also religion scholar. And having grown up in the South, I was awash in kind of evangelical background and everything. So I think that's what kind of sparked it. And I went looking for what are Christians, how are they handling the UFO response? And by and large, mainstream Protestantism just ignores it. The Vaticans are like, well, we'll baptize them if they get here, so it's kind of, they land, we'll just baptize them. Why not? Make them good Catholics.
They can join us, right?
Yeah, they can we'll just dunk them. Come on. And even Vatican II, I think, even had a statement, or the Vatican came out with a statement, maybe post Vatican II, about ETs, and saying that they're part of God's creation too. Well, no problem. But for the main part, the conservative Christians where I'm from in Tennessee, they didn't have a stance. They just nothing's happening. There's no such thing. And I thought, well, that's kind of Ancient Aliens is in its 15th season. Obviously this has captured the imagination of America, and it's a competing meta narrative religiously, I think, because the people that I've encountered that have had some kind of UFO experience or whatever, it takes over their lives. It becomes the thing that's their life now, and they get completely absorbed in it. So it's like here's this competing meta narrative that you should be engaged with if you're claiming kind of this proselytizing impetus or whatever. But they weren't, nobody. And so I found another, even more fringe group of evangelicals that were kind of, but they connect it to this deeper kind of, this older theory of where demons and stuff came from. And so, yeah, that's kind of where it was sparked. Like, how come nobody's looking at this? It's still pretty small. Heiser's audience is really, really small. It's not like you're not going to go to like a Billy Graham crusade and somewhere in the middle of it, they're going to talk about UFOs. It's going to eat your soul. Not yet.
Maybe that speaks to the atomizing of our world anyway, where there is no kind of, the prospect of going to any kind of mass group event right now is, it's not necessarily a positive one. So why not just, break down into these, smaller subsets? Yeah.
And
can
they use,
that?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was getting carried away there.
Well, I'm gonna help you there, I guess, because you say there is not much of an audience, but I was struck by how similar Heiser's theory is to David Icke's.
Oh,
and
sure.
I have never heard of Heiser before, but I wanted to ask you what do you think about the sort of interchanges and economies between, like, is there a professional jealousy there? Like, do they get angry at each other for poaching each other's audiences, or what do you think goes on?
I think with Heiser, he's digging into Hebrew. So like the snake in the Garden of Eden is like this reptilian ancient Near Eastern god. So I don't think he's really like, I know he's aware of David Icke, but I don't think he's digging into that. He's mainly planting his flag on his knowledge of Hebrew and Sumerian and cuneiform and this stuff. But with Ike, I think he would disassociate himself. But it's funny because Zecharia Sitchin, another one of these kind of chariots of the gods, UFOs are really another one of those. For a long time, Heiser had a website dedicated to dismantling his credibility. He had a website. He owned the website called ZechariahSitchinisWrong.com. That was the name of the website. So,
Wow.
So
and he would
precious.
just constantly post, how come? Because Sitchin couldn't read the original languages, so he would just kind of make up his own translation. It says rocket here in this tablet, and then over here it says planet Nibiru, and over here on this planet it's planet X, and then Heiser would take him to task on these different things. So yeah, maybe it is a bit professional jealousy, but I haven't seen him attack. I mean, Ike is even far out there for the far out people.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And he's got a huge audience, considering he gives 6-hour talks. It's just that this idea of the demonic thing that lurks behind the facade of the facade, and the eating the lifeblood of this and that is what I'm familiar with from or through Ike.
Yeah. Well, it goes back even older. The last picture that I had there was from a round trip to hell in a flying saucer, and that's from '55, and it has similar overtones of this
Wow.
kind of demonic conspiracy that is sucking the life. But that particular narrative of having witnessed UFOs taking the life force out of people comes from a channeled message in the '60s, I believe. In Redfern's book, he mentions. This is back to Catherine. Redfern's book that I talked about, he has a couple of chapters on Parsons and all of his ritual sex magic and how it's connected into the rocket development. And so yeah, I think it's. But does it drive anybody else crazy reading ufology? Like reading that the people who are writing, it drives me mad. Like Mirage Men was really hard to read. It's like every paragraph is gestural, and that's it. They're only like pointing to something. They're never really saying it. Just get to the point.
Yeah. Well, that was the question. Is that the dance, right? Is that the way that you perform it? Is it really understanding? Of course, this is not a unique idea, but the idea that conspiracies are fun because you never get to the bottom, right? Is the bottomless, mystery, as was brought up, so what is the goal, and then there was also the suggestion is that maybe for the most of us, we can only have so much, right? We only take so much of it. So maybe it's just coping with the fact that this is a part of our reality or surreality, or however you want to look at it. So, yeah.
I've got a quick question to Catherine, if we are still.
Yeah.
I'm happy to. I just have the dinner to make.
Yes.
I wonder if they ever bring up Rosemary's Baby in the podcast.
No, not that one. Although there are tons of references to different things. One that kind of stuck, a few that stuck with me were this kind of mysterious story of, oh my gosh, I think Lyle Spevik, which was this guy that they kind of discovered that had committed suicide in some hotel in Washington, but he had no known history. He had no identification, no nothing. This guy kind of just came from nowhere. So that was a really interesting one if you're gonna look into it.
I'm asking about Rosemary's Baby because, as far as I know, that's where the tennis thing comes from. The tennis root.
Yeah, is that it's like an ancient Egyptian?
Well,
is that?
no, in the book, it's
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yep,
Yeah.
they're digging in the wrong place.
Yeah.
It's in Ira Levin's book, tennis root is just a herb, but it's a satanic associated.
Mhm.
Okay.
Satanic. And he spells it with two N's, and that's, I mean, I didn't research it in depth, but as far as I know, he invented that word, like he just named it something.
Yeah, you know, I actually haven't read that, but they, in the podcast, kind of there being like that being the name of this myth that does have some kind of Egyptology.
There's a real city in Egypt.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
But
wonder,
very
though,
interesting. I'll look into that.
Catherine, I was wondering if I'm remembering it correctly. He ends up in some weird cabin that keeps disappearing, and doesn't he goes underground? He meets some primal god that has like a moose head or something. Am I remembering it right?
Yeah. So in the story, Nick does find a cabin, which they kind of signify as a portal to another dimension, basically. And there's kind of this liminal space portion where he's in this other dimension and leads like a whole life there, kind of under the guise of, it's very unclear, but under this entity that they call Eldfin, which kind of seem demonic in some way, or, you know, very powerful, or able to control people's bodies or actions or health even. Yeah, that's kind of one facet of it. And then there is the more scientific faction and the story reach, and that it's actually just these, you know, kind of measurable anomalies that create people's experiences. So really fun listen.
Yeah, they lost me when they went. I mean, I like the verisimilitude stuff where you couldn't tell the difference if this is being made or whatever. But then when they finally did get into the alternate reality, it was kind of like it was the format was harder to follow. When he was phoning in his calls and was talking, it was really difficult to keep track. Okay, which reality is in right now?
Right.
And how is he sending up the frame?
Yeah, I thought so
difficult
too. I thought it did kind of break
Yeah,
down as far as the verisimilitude idea.
Yeah, But it was very similar to American Gods by Neil Gaiman. If you haven't read that, there's this kind of prehistoric entity that he runs it that he talked about in that, and it's like, man, this is almost exactly like Pam.
Yeah, I didn't put that together, but definitely kind of similar, like that, you know, ancient being in the modern world kind of idea.
See, we're good conspiracists. We can put random things together and say there's a real pattern.
Yeah, I'm getting better and better at it all the time.
That's what academics do all the time anyway, isn't it?
Right? I mean, where's the line?
How you just happen to find the right book, right?
Well, should we call it a session?
Yeah,
I suppose so. It's been really wonderful.
This was fun.
Thank you all.
Nice to meet all of you.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Lots of very interesting, and they really came together in interesting ways too. Yeah.
Yeah, this was good. Thanks for putting it together, Kenneth. This was
my pleasure. Thanks for coming out to do it. You made it.
Well,
you all made it. So
well thought
Thanks, everyone.
You too.
okay. Goodbye.
All right.
All right. Bye, everyone.